Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 59, December 13th, 2006. We're visiting with Jack McBrayer, longtime Cooperative Elevator Manager. Jack, where and when were you born?
December 13th, 1937.
Okay.
In Ethan, South Dakota.
Ethan, South Dakota. And what was your father's name?
My father's name was Donald McBrayer from Ethan, South Dakota. And my mother was Jeanette Lamberts, and she came from the small town of Dolton, South Dakota. So they were farmers in the Ethan, on the border of Davison and Hanson County. They farmed a little bit in both counties, but it was south and east of Ethan.
Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little bit about your father? What sort of a person was he?
My dad was a true blood farmer, if you wanted to classify it that way. Dad started out with his father on the farm, and that's the only occupation he really ever knew was farming. They started out with back in the days when all the farming was done with horses, everything dragging and disking and planting, and the whole criteria was tractors and horses and horses only. Tractors didn't come into his farm operation until somewhere in about 1940, somewhere 39 or 40 in there somewhere. I was too small to remember the first tractor, but I remember about the second tractor that he had.
Okay. What about your mother?
My mother came from Dolton, South Dakota, and she came from a large family. Grandpa was a small farmer and a carpenter I guess if you'd call it back in them days, a second income. I don't know which was his major, but he'd done a lot of carpentry work, and he had a small farm there by Dolton, and raised 13 kids on that farm, and also by carpentering. So he had a gallant life.
And where was your family originally from? They were in South Dakota, but they started out somewhere else, maybe overseas even. My
original, and on the McBrayer side, there was 3 brothers came across. They were Irishmen, mm-hmm. and back in some of the civil strifes they had over there, they sort of immigrated over into Scotland, and then they came here from Scotland. And they settled on the East Coast, and then they worked their way through, like in Maryland, Pennsylvania. Then when they got into the central part of the United States, the 3 brothers decided they would go different directions. And one turned backward, sort of, and went south and into Georgia. He wanted to have a plantation. One went south into Alabama, and he had a plantation there. And my grandfather, he came on out through, and then he settled, and his dad settled in Missouri, in around the Gallatin, Missouri area. And then, like I said, his grandfather and great-grandfather and then my grandfather were all from the Missouri area. Grandpa came up here in, I don't remember the year, but I'm going to say like 1904, somewhere's in there, and bought the farm southeast of Ethan and stayed there the rest of his entire life, and was a farmer, and he fed a few cattle, and was just I guess you'd call it a diversified farm in them days, but he had 320 acres. So.
Mm-hmm. What about your mother's family?
My mother's family, they come out of Germany, and I'm not as versed on where they came from, but they came and settled into Iowa, in around Carroll, Iowa. And then in the early days, they came out of Carroll, Iowa, and up into Parker. And one of my, I've got a picture, and one of my grandfather's house near Parker was one of the first 2-roomed sod houses that was built in that Parker area, and they were there for a while, and then they went over and bought a farm south of and east of Dolton, close to the Bridgewater territory, and remained there all the rest of their life. So basically, the Lamberts family came out of Carroll, Iowa. I know they were further east than that, but I haven't been able to research yet as how far back they go.
Mm-hmm. You have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, in our family, there was 9 living children, and my mom and dad lost a little girl who would have been 65 years ago on the 11th of December.
Big families, that was fairly common in those days.
Yes,
you lose one.
Yeah, it was, they didn't have the services we have today, and it was very common, and she had a few problems as an unborn child, and of course at birth, why those problems multiplied, and they lost her the first day. But then there was 9 living children, and we are kind of scattered out through. We all stayed on the farm. The 9 children all graduated from Ethan High School and graduated on out, and I have a brother still on the family farm at home down there by Ethan. They do not farm like Dad did. They've more or less turned it into a cattle operation that way, and he rents out part of the farm ground. Mm-hmm. But and my sister lives in Ethan, and I'm here, and then 4 of the brothers, they migrated back to Georgia. They got down into Georgia, and then one sister lives in New York, and one lives in Rapid.
Okay. What are some of your early memories out on the farm when you were a kid? I suppose that we're talking the early 40s before you start to remember it.
Yes, we lived on a farm, on a rented farm over east of Ethan there, and I often tell my dad when he was alive, the things I can remember. And I can remember very vividly when they used to go to Ethan Lake and saw ice and haul it home with the teams and the ice racks, if you want to call them that, and slide them down into the storm cellar. And we stored ice there for 2 or 3 neighbors. I can remember that. I can remember some of the first blizzards. But like I said, I can remember Dad doing the farm work basically all with a team of horses. They just... team of horses, and they planted the corn, and I can remember the harvesting the corn all by hand. I can remember, and I drove tractor on the binder a lot and shocked a lot of small grain. So it goes back to the days in the thrash machine. My father owned the thrash machine. He ran the thrash run, and I think there was about 9 of the neighbors that thrashed around him. All that was done with team and horses, the whole thing. And so we shocked a lot of grain. We cut a lot of grain with the binder. We cultivated a lot of corn and pulled a lot of weeds too. Back in them days, I don't believe there was anything like 2,4-D. Mm-hmm. So Dad said maybe that's why he had a 6 boys. I don't know, because he had weed pullers. But we pulled our weeds in our corn. We walked it twice a year and pulled the weeds. And so we done our farm work, like I said, a lot by hand, a lot of muscle power, but it never hurt a one of us, It was something for him to do to keep his family occupied, because there just wasn't that many other things to go around. Mm-hmm. My dad was a great baseball fan, and we had a nice alfalfa field close to the house. And Dad would always tell us, boys, you guys get the work done today, and then tomorrow invite your friends out, and I'll pitch. And you guys can play workup out there in the alfalfa field. And so he took his time off that way, and we had a lot. It was only a mile and a half out of town. The kids could get there easy, and we had a lot of backyard baseball games in them days. And so it was a good life. It was a very good life. As I look back, I often tell people that I couldn't have been born in a more opportune time, because I don't remember the 30s when it was dry and money was so short and stuff like that. From the time I can remember on up, we were working with horses. We went into the tractors. We went into bigger tractors. The farming just got better and better and better, and the whole economy just kept getting better and better. So I think I was born about as good a lifetime as there could ever be. We don't know what the future is going to be like, but it's been great up until now.
Did your dad talk much about what had happened back in the 30s and 20s?
Yes, we visited a lot about that, how dry it was, and how the crickets were bad and the grasshoppers were bad. So he really versed us boys. Now I don't know whether he was trying to make it sound so tough, but he really versed us boys on what life was really like back there, how him and Grandpa struggled back in them days to keep things going. And so I think it was probably maybe a history lesson as well as it was an educational lesson. He was telling us that life is not easy. You've got to go out there and work hard and be real productive in order to stay alive.
Do you think maybe the country has lost something because very few, if any, kids are growing up in that kind of environment anymore?
Yeah, I really feel in my own mind that we've lost a lot. The first, there's some First of all, our farm family numbers are way, way down. That's really down. And then they've made farming a little bit easier with the bigger tractors, the more modern machinery and stuff like that. So I really believe that there's probably more spare time now on the farms than there used to be. And I sometimes wonder if those young farmers are able to utilize that spare time as well as we did to make it a family affair. Mm-hmm. We can get in our automobile and we can go to town quick. We can go in a neighboring town quick. We couldn't do that. So we had to provide, Dad and Mom had to provide entertainment for the kids right there at home, right there in our backyard, to keep us all busy and to keep us all satisfied. Mm-hmm. And there again, you didn't know another side, but you knew that what you were doing made you happy. We were always fed. We were never hungry and stuff like this here. And we had to wear a few hand-me-down clothes, but we always had plenty to eat and stuff like that. I wouldn't say Dad had plenty of money at first, but we had always provided plenty of food.
So when you were young, what did you want to do? Did you want to farm, or did you aspire to something else? Obviously, there were a whole bunch of you guys, so you couldn't all take over the family farm.
No, I think I probably realized, being the second boy out of 6, that I probably wasn't going to be the one that would take over the family farm because my dad was so young. He was a young man and stuff like that. So I never really had the desire to be a full-fledged farmer. I loved to go out there, help Dad every day and stuff, but I just knew that I probably would never get the opportunity, so I didn't tell myself, I want to be a farmer. But very young in life, I realized that I liked farming. I liked what they did and everything like that, so I started working at the elevator as a very young man, helping out and stuff like that. And then I realized that, hey, I like farmers. I like to work with farmers. I want to have some type of a job where I do work with farmers and stuff like that. And stay in the ag part of it. And so when I had the opportunity to go to work at the elevator there in Ethan as a real young man, I took it. And that's where my career started, was in Ethan, South Dakota.
Okay. Were your parents members of any Farmers Union or any other organizations down there?
I really couldn't tell you for sure. Mm-hmm. I know they were active in Farmers Union because of all the neighbors that we had. Mm-hmm. Down there, Harold Nearhood and them were big at it. So I know they had a very active. I shouldn't say a very active, but a real tie there. But Dad and Mother spent a lot of time with school, the CSO, back in them days and stuff like that. And so they spent a lot of time to try to make the educational facility there provide a real good education for the farm kids as well as the town kids. So I guess, if in a sense of the word maybe, so that they didn't kind of leave the farm children out of the way the education was going, and then of course Dad loved sports, so he made us kids participate in sports. In the spring of the year, it was a little bit difficult to be in sports because of the spring planting, but in the fall of the year, Dad could handle that stuff, and he said, you're going to go out for football, you're going to go out for basketball and stuff like that, and we did.
Did you go to school right there in Ethan throughout? So you were relatively close to town then.
Yeah, we were only a mile and a half from town, and really they didn't have it at when I was the age. But when I was 5, I loved school, and my older brother was 1 year ahead of me, and he went to a country school for 1 year. And so the teacher over there, they didn't have many students, and so I suppose I bugged my mom to death to go to school. So the teacher said, yeah, send him over there anytime he wants to come, he can come to school. So I did go to school a lot as a 5-year-old in the country school, but I started first grade in Ethan, and like I said, my brother went 1 year to country school, and him and I and the other 7 kids went on through Ethan and graduated from Ethan, each one of us.
What was school like in Ethan for grade schools? And this would have been, you probably started in, about 1943?
Yeah, it's at 42, 43.
43.
Yeah, back in there. And there was about 20 per class in that. And of course we had the old traditional schoolhouse, the 2-story school, and there was 4 rooms in the first floor, and there was the assembly room and the other rooms upstairs, and first, second, third, fourth, and you moved out through. It was fun. I mean, we had a good time in school, and like I said, there was about, I'd say 15 to 20 per class, and maybe a little bit less than that in the lower grades, because they had so many country schools operating it. Mm-hmm. But as we got up in towards high school, then we began to run about 20 per class. And there again, in them days, there was only 4 teachers, and they had 80 kids, and they took care of them.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you went right on to high school there.
Yes.
And graduated in
1955.
Okay. Did you attend college?
No, I didn't attend college. Like I said, I started to work like in 1950, 52 and 53. Mm-hmm. We unloaded the coal for the elevator and stuff like that. Then my dad bought a large elevator, and we helped fill the old government bin sites when they began to build the bin sites and stuff like that. And I would take time off of school. I wouldn't want to say that I was smart, but I could catch up easy. So I'd take a lot of time off and help Dad with that elevator, and we worked for the elevator. We had this big elevator, and I remember back in them days they had built a big ramp. There was no hoist, but they had built a big old wood ramp, and them smaller farm trucks would roar up on that platform. So a little of the corn would round out of the back, and then the rest of it we scooped and pulled out, and we would go in there and take corn in. If I remember right, they only did that on certain days of the week and stuff like that. So I began to help my dad with his enterprise, if you want to call it that, with the elevator. And that's where I began to realize that farmers were fun to work with. Farmers were very interesting to talk to, and they always had something new happening. You know, so many of us that work in town, it's the same thing about every day. Yeah. But out there, they had something new happening all the time, and there was always something different to talk about. And I enjoyed unloading their trucks, and most of them at that time was little old gravity box wagons and things like that we had to shovel off. But they always had time to visit and talk to you when they were in there dumping their corn off, and so it was fun. Then in the spring of 1955, the elevator needed an employee real bad. It was just at that point, a 1.5 man operation, and they needed a full-time employee real bad, so they asked me to work there, and I was finishing high school. So I went to the superintendent, and I explained him what the situation was, and he said, Jack, he said, you take your books and you study. You have to come back when the rest of your class takes their test, but you can go and help at the elevator. You know, Ethan wasn't that big a town, and so everybody knew and understood the other guy's problem. And the guy at the elevator, if you want to call it that, he had a problem. He needed somebody to help. Mm-hmm. So I did that. Then I went to down there and went to work, and it just worked out so that it was rainy weather when the last week of final exams. So I went back to school. I wrote my tests with everybody else, and then went on to work there full time. And then as it went on, Kennebec out there was losing their assistant manager, and Harry Taylor from Letcher, South Dakota, come to see me, and he said, Jack, he said, I have a beautiful opportunity for you if you want to go to Kennebec. And so we talked about it a little bit and decided to go out there for an interview, and went out there for an interview and was accepted out there in their staff. And Grandma cried and cried and cried. She knew the Indians was going to get me, and I was never coming home. And that was too far to go. That was 100 miles. But we made the journey out there, and that was basically the start, the beginning of our career. As I say, I went in there as assistant manager, and then a few years later, the manager retired, and they appointed me manager of that cooperative, and that was the beginning of my career.
Okay. I have about 5 or 6 questions here about military service, but you graduated from high school in between the wars, so you...
Yeah. You know, like I said earlier, there was 6 of us boys, mm-hmm. and the ages of my brothers and the time frame in the wars, there was 6 of us that never had any military duty. I was in the National Guard when we lived around here because the Guard unit was in Mitchell. When I went to Kennebec, it was so far away and stuff like that to attend the meeting. I got my discharge from the Guards, and my older brother went to school at South Dakota State University, and he was in the ROTC. But that basically is all the military connections that we really had, was that short stint of mine in the National Guard here in Mitchell and his at ROTC in Brookings.
And back in those days, they weren't looking to the National Guard to be deployed overseas.
No, they weren't. That wasn't the. So, I know we were training to be backup, but I think it was more backup if we were needed here than it was if we were needed overseas. Yeah, stuff like that.
Blizzards in the wintertime.
Disasters.
Yeah. Where did you meet your wife?
We were high school. I met her in grade school, and we was grade school, high school, all the while, and stuff like that. So she lived on a farm. She was a farm girl, lived north and west of Ethan a ways, and I lived south of Ethan. So we knew each other, I suppose, from the time we were, probably I'll say the fourth grade on. We were both Catholics, and so we attended catechism together. So, and it might have even been earlier than that, but we were together. But really, as far as remembering who she was, it got to be in the fourth and fifth grade through catechism and through activities there in Ethan that we would meet each other and stuff like that, then on up into high school. So
what's her name?
Mana Montefray. And Mana is a twin girl. She had a twin sister, Donna, and like I say, we were in high school together.
Okay. When did you get married?
We got married in Ethan in 1954.
54. Okay.
Yeah, I got married before I was out of high school.
Okay.
And that's another reason I really knew that I had to get a job and work hard and be productive because I was married young.
Okay. You have kids?
Yeah, we have 4 of our own children, and we adopted one boy. We have, first of all, after the 4 children and during the 4 children, we done a lot of foster care when we lived in Kennebec. And then along came the opportunity to adopt a little boy, a Native American boy, so we adopted that boy. But we raised 3 other Native American children, spent a lot of days, hours, and weeks with them, months and years with them, and helping them. They came from families that were, I wouldn't want to say it was a broken family, but it was a family that had no morals, and children weren't something that they wanted to have in their way of life, and so some of them were given up and some of them were taken away from there. But we have one boy that's in Fort Thompson yet. They brought him to our house. His mother was going to have heart surgery, and she died in Denver having heart surgery. So they were left without a mother. She was doing a good job on raising the children. She had a boy and 2 girls, but her early death because of that, left them. So they brought him to our place, and he still is at Fort Thompson out there, doing quite well. And the older boy is in Sisseton, and he's doing quite well. And he never forgets a birthday, an anniversary, and as you saw there in the interview, he called me this morning. He didn't have a late in life. He didn't have a mother and a father, and we're still mom and dad. Although we never adopted him and stuff like that. So he calls this morning and said, "Happy birthday, Dad." Makes you feel pretty good. And that was in 1958 when we started that project with helping the Indian children out there.
What are the names of all your kids, and where are they all at these days?
The oldest,
some of those.
The oldest girl is Kathy, and she married a boy from Presho, and his last name is Diedrich, Don Diedrich, and they live in Sioux Falls. The next girl is Connie. She's divorced, and she has 2 children. Backing up to Kathy, she has 3 children. Connie is the next daughter, and she is divorced and living in California, and she has 2 children. She's in the medical profession. She went to South Dakota School of Mines and got into the medical part of it right away. The next girl is Karen. She lives in Rapid City. She's in charge and works in the emergency room at the hospital in Deadwood. She's a nurse practitioner. She hopes someday that her youngest of 3 is graduating from high school this year, and then she's going to hope to go back and get her doctorate. when she has just a little bit more time. And the next was Kurt. That's the first of our oldest boy, and Kurt lives here in Mitchell, and he's in business with his father. And then the next boy is the boy we adopted, and his name is Corey, and he also lives here in Mitchell.
Okay. You talked about going to work at the Cooperative in Ethan. Were your parents Cooperative members?
Yes. Yeah, Dad done all of his business there between the co-op elevator in Ethan and the co-op elevator in Dimmock. I mean, we even sold our pigs through the co-op way at the marketing station there in Dimmock. And so Dad was very, and he bought his fuels and stuff like co-op. He was very co-op minded.
At some point, I try to ask everybody, what did you like about cooperatives as a way of doing business? Was there an attraction there?
Yeah, so really, once I got in it and learned the whole infrastructure, you're doing business with yourself. And I guess basically that kind of sums it up, You're doing business with yourself. You do have a voice in how the business should be run. One voice does not run it, but still you have that voice. You can attend the meetings. You can make suggestions and stuff like that. You have the opportunity to vote along with other members on how things should be done and how the cooperative should grow. So doing business with yourself, I think, is one of the biggest key inspirational ideas that I had to becoming a co-op manager and try to make those co-ops successful if I could, is because those people were doing business with themselves and I was just an instrument. But I knew that I had to make the right calls to do it right for them.
What year was it when you went out to Kennebec?
Went out to Kennebec in 1956.
56. How were things out there? What kind of issues did you have to deal with in 1956? Obviously, substantially different than the issues facing co-ops in late years.
When we went out there in 1956, that was an eye-opener. We had, of course, never had lived. We had never vacationed and stuff like that out there. The lifestyle there was so much different than the lifestyle here for a couple reasons. The agricultural part of it wasn't that heavy. It was just beginning to swing into the agricultural part. There was a lot of beef cattle, a lot of cattle, sheep, and stuff like that. But they just were beginning to break heavier into the farming part of it, the actual grain operations. But it was just so different. It was wide open. I mean, it was wide open. We had a barrel of fun. It was just so different. There again, the people out there, whether we were good candidates or what, I'm not going to say, but we were very well received. We very well received. We just enjoyed that lifestyle out there so well.
Okay. Transportation is always an issue for elevators. What kind of rail service did you have in the 1950s? That was the Milwaukee line there, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the Milwaukee line, and it originated here in Mitchell and ran west, and the line that went through Kennebec went as far as Murdo. And then they had a turnaround at Murdo, and then they came back. So our rail service was good. They came through Kennebec, I will say, depending upon how many stops they had, I suppose, from 11 o'clock in the morning till maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon, they came through Kennebec. They went to Murdo. They bedded down in Murdo, turned themselves around, and headed back the other day. The next morning, and so they dropped off the mail when they were coming through. The next morning, then, when they went back through, they picked up the cream and that kind of stuff, all the produce there at the depot, and headed back towards Mitchell. I'm not positive anymore what time they got back to Mitchell, but I would imagine they were in Kennebec pretty early in the morning, so I suppose they were back to Mitchell by, sundown or evening hours there. And then it depended upon the time of year it was. The time of the year when harvesting was going on and grain was moving, well, they had to stop at each little town and drop off 3 or 4 or 5 cars, whatever their orders were. So that took them a little longer. The next day going back to Mitchell, they had to pick up the cars that the elevators had filled the day before. So they took them a little bit longer too. But everything moved by rail. There was oil moving, there was cattle moving, and just about everything was moving by rail.
Yeah. Did you have a paved road by there at that time? You didn't have the interstate.
Highway 16 was paved, but Highway 16 was very, very narrow. Now, they had widened Highway 16 about to Kimball, I think. But from Kimball west, it was just wide enough for two cars. There was no shoulder, but it was oil. And you went down through Puckwan, through Chamberlain, and up the old steep hills there at Oklahoma. So the oil road was very narrow through there. But the country roads was gumbo. That I think was another thing that really opened our eyes, is the fact that those people had a hard time getting to town when it was wet, and a lot of them still had to bring their teams into town to get there, because there's no way a vehicle could run down them old muddy gumbo roads. And some of the old timers out there told me when after we first moved out there, they said, "Jack, there's only two things about gumbo. When it's dry, it won't stick to nothing, and when it's wet, it'll stick to you and your boots both, and that was true. You could bog down in that gumbo so fast. But so rural transportation, there wasn't any trucks running around the country and stuff like that, because you get a quarter inch of rain, you couldn't go nowhere. It was just slick. So they didn't do it. It was just
So there was a real concern about the existence of farm-to-market roads.
Oh, yeah, farm-to-market.
They were terrible, huh?
Oh, they were terrible. Yep. And like I said, and then that era, that's just about the time they began to improve them. They gravelled a nice road south of Kennebec. They oiled a road from Presho south. They oiled a road from Vivian north, and they gravelled a nice road from Kennebec north. So farmers then had, if they could get there, had a pretty good gravel road to come to town on. So a lot of them, they left a vehicle at the gravel road and then took a saddle horse and something like that back and forth to their farms, because they couldn't get out there in case it did come up with a quick rain. I mean, there's a lot of times when people were in town and it would come up one of them real quick showers, and you didn't go home because you couldn't get there. It was just too gooey.
Government storage payments were a significant thing for elevators, were they?
Yes,
in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, the government needed places. Like I said, the early part of the 50s, we were putting a lot of grain in them government bin sites. But then out there, agriculture began to grow and grow. They didn't have a very big bin site there in Lyman County. It was very big, but the grain that was being produced was overfilling them so fast that the board members there, and this was a lot of other input into it, but the board members there decided, they made their first move in 1952. They built 4 large steel bolted tanks that were hooked onto the elevator, and they held 20,000 bushel apiece. So the government said, "Okay, Co-op, you take in this grain and we'll give you X number of cents per bushel per month to store it for us until we call it." And so the elevator in 52 built them 4 steel tanks, and they were full all the time. And there again, for the co-op, the revenue back off of that was very, very good. So in 58, we put up the first big concrete elevator there, and that held 250,000 bushel. And I think that lasted about 3 weeks, and it was full. And so grain storage then for the government was one of the biggest tools that we as managers could use to increase the size of our existing structure, provide a better service for those farmers that lived in our trade territory, and have a lot more room at harvest time. Because about that time was when the vast majority of the custom combiners began to roll up from the south, and so you had to be able to take the grain in pretty fast. Otherwise, they had no big outlet for them. There wasn't any opportunity for them to come up here and combine grain with their bigger machines than what the local people had if they couldn't get rid of it. You know, and back in them days, I don't think there was a farmer that owned an auger bigger than a 6-inch auger. So even their truckloads of grain couldn't unload very fast. So you had to step up some method of handling the grain quicker to entice more of the custom harvester to bring his big Kansas equipment up here and harvest that way. And that has all changed a lot. You know, as agriculture moved up, we have a lot of North Dakota harvesters now that go down into Kansas and Nebraska, and then they come back and they harvest a lot of grain in South Dakota. Then they move back home to North Dakota. And they have just as big or bigger machines now than what them Kansas farmers had at that time coming up here to harvest for us. And that was another thing that really it was an eye-opener, if you want to call it that. And no one was trained or used to having a harvest go that fast and furious and stuff like that. So we had to regroup ourselves to be able to accommodate that custom harvester, you know, and they wanted to go fast.
And custom harvesting probably is more prevalent out in that country than it is further east.
Yes, very much more, because there's a lot of farmers out there that didn't have a combine when I went out there, and I don't know if some of them farmers ever bought one. I don't believe it. I think there's a lot of farmers out there that never even owned one because the custom combiner was there, and some of them farmers that raised wheat in the 1960s and stuff like that weren't even raising wheat in 1956 when I went out there because they didn't have the drills, the equipment, all that kind of stuff. So they just stayed with their cattle. Well, when the custom combiners began to roll in and there was ways to harvest that grain, then they began to break up sod and stuff like that and began to get into the winter wheat production and the milo production. And of course, it just grew and grew and grew.
And of course, the amount of debt having to be taken on in those days with the harvest equipment was not anywhere close to what it is today.
Oh gosh, no, huh? No, I don't remember figures and stuff like that, but it was phenomenal what they when you look back as what the price was. You know, you could buy some of that equipment for what the wheels cost off of them now, probably. But and they were good. They weren't big, they weren't as fast, but they were good. It was good equipment. Yeah. It was very good equipment.
Yeah. Did you when you're working out there at Kennebec, did you have a chance to work with some interesting people?
Yes. As I, like I said, I went out there as assistant manager. Of course, my boss at that time, he took care of all that.
Who was the manager out there?
The manager's name was Reuben Hehn, H-E-H-N. He the co-op there started in 1947, and they had another guy that managed it for a short while. And Reuben worked for the government in a position like FHA in that department, like in kind of that department, helping farmers and stuff like that. Well, they started the co-op and they had a manager hired, and he just couldn't adjust to the running part of it. So they asked Reuben if he would like to take care of the management part of it, the operational part of it, and the current manager was going to step down and do the driveway work. And that's what they did. And then they started that way. And his name was Reuben Hehn, and like I said, after I went out there, he took care of meeting most of the people. But in I'll say about 1965, it was very apparent that he was going to be retiring. So he, as well as the board, introduced me into a lot of other facets of the management part of it, and that was to attend meetings, meet people, and stuff like that. And that's when I began to meet a vast amount of people and began to, I don't know what you want to call it, get into the co-op educational field so I could bring stuff back home to our members on how it was being done in other areas and what they could expect to happen in the future and how they would have to address that locally at their elevator as well as on their own farms to be prepared. Because change was coming. Yeah.
How about board members? Did you deal a lot with those when you were on staff before you were a manager?
Yeah, they were again, board members were farmers and stuff like that. They harvested their grain and everything else. But the board members in that time was they spent a lot of time. I shouldn't say a lot of time, but they had more frequent visits at their elevator probably than what the board members do today, because the board members today are so much busier.
Yeah.
Those board members, when I first went out there, were small farmers, and they had more time to stop at the elevator. They had a little bit more concern maybe with how that bottom line was looking and stuff like that, to make sure that everybody was planning ahead. And there was no interference. I mean, none of them really ever come along and said, you should be doing it this way, you shouldn't be doing it that way. But they were there for backup. You could always talk to them when they were there. You could always make suggestions on how it might work better if we did it that way and things like that. Not trying to go behind the current manager's back, but they wanted some input from the actual employees themselves. So it was very interesting. And most of the board members were, I would say, when I first went out there, was kind of semi-retired farmers, and they were great. I mean, that was a great group of guys.
And probably, since they were amongst probably the founders of the co-op, they were probably pretty cooperative-minded people.
Yes, very cooperative-minded. Now, one of them, the chairman of the board, when I went out there, was Harry Caslin. He was so involved with the Farmers Union and the Farmers Union insurance and the co-op structure all the way around. Joe Quillen was the secretary of the board, and he was a farmer. He was a Farmers Union man himself. Dutch Reelman was on it. Frank Reed was on the board. Henry Wooster was on the board, and his son is Jim Wooster, that is giving a mark. Yeah, the Wooster boys, And so they were very, very co-op-minded. And there again, I think the same thing, they applied the same thing into their life as I talked about earlier. They realized that the co-op that they were directors for was a place where farmers could do business with themselves, and we have got to be a leader to make sure that everything is done quite right. So they were very concerned with how the thing was operated, and they didn't have probably the concerns that face a board of directors or a manager today, because we're marketing worldwide, and that wasn't present then. All we really had to do was get that car coopered and get that wheat in there, and somebody else took it from there on up. We done business with Farmers Union GTA, and you just called them up and gave them the car number, and they marketed everything for you. Whereas today, the local managers and stuff like that, there's all by unit trains and all that kind of stuff. So the scope is so different today than what it was then.
And sometimes I have to take a minute here to catch up with where I'm at here. Did you probably in those days you didn't have any board members who were maybe not as loyal cooperative members?
No.
Did you ever have any like that?
No, I never had a board member that was not cooperative minded and stuff like that. We did have one that, at times, that probably he marketed where he thought it was the best. And not that he marketed somewhere else to be anti-co-op, but he just had different marketing trends and stuff like that. Then it come down to the point where in his particular area of farmers, he was a good leader, a good man, and they would ask him if he wouldn't fill the position of a retiring board member, and he would. Well, then, of course, he converted right over. I never had a man on our boards that would come in and tell you how to do things, vote yes and no on proposals, and turn around the next day and buy somebody else's feed or market his grain somewhere else. There again, my era. Now, probably today they have a little more trouble with that, but not in my time frame. They were leaders, and they realized they didn't dare. They were leaders, and they represented a lot of their farmers. They didn't hardly they didn't want to be seen taking home a load of feed from some other company. They didn't want to be seen dumping their truck in Brand X elevator and stuff like that, because if they couldn't provide the best service for themselves, then they weren't doing their job as a board member. See, and so it made a lot of good ties between board member and their cooperative. They were pretty loyal.
And around there, it probably extended over to not wanting maybe to be seen pumping gas someplace out besides the Cenex Co-op.
Yeah, see, and so it was. I guess they had to be leaders. That would be the best thing I could say. They had to be leaders instead of followers. And if you followed your neighbor over to Brand X gas station and filled up over there, you weren't doing a very good job at your co-op. And that was another thing that we really were fortunate in Lyman County. There, we had a very good co-op, Farmers Union Co-op oil station there. And so the farmers were buying gas there. They were buying feed from us. They were doing pretty much 100% of their business with the cooperatives.
Going back to an issue we talked about before, where you were still you were at the elevator when the government stopped making those storage payments. What kind of impact did that have on elevators in your experience?
It's one thing. I guess the biggest impact it had was it began to it kind of put an end to growth. There was, in other words, you couldn't have a large structure there that the cooperative owned that wouldn't be full of grain almost all the time, and the storage rates were pretty good. Lines at harvest time got to be long at elevators. Custom combiners began to bring in bigger equipment, so farmers began to build storage at home for two reasons. One is the government paid them quite well, and that was one way they could pay for their investment. And the second thing was then they didn't have to fight the lineups at the elevators to get dumped. And so it went from the elevator building the large facilities to store grain back to where the farmers began to put them up on their own farm. And they had a better marketing tool that way, if you want to call it that way, a little bit more flexibility and things like that. So it stopped growth. And
okay. And going back to railroads, you want to comment on the changes that happened with rail service over the years. You talked about early on in the 50s, it still being pretty good, but it didn't stay that way.
No, it didn't stay that way. Like I say, we had everyday freight going back and forth through Kennebec. Then pretty soon it cut down to wasn't quite that often. And I would have to say that the worst decline that we experienced with the railroad was, let's start out in 1956. The rail cars were fairly new, and as they kept going up and up and up, you get into the 65s. The railroad practically refused to fix anything up as long as it had a coupler on one end and a coupler on the other end, and it would stay in the middle of a train. Pull it. Let those guys fix it up. So we were getting to the point where the equipment was so poor that it was so hard to keep them from leaking. In the first place, it's so hard to get them coopered up. If you want to talk about it, you have the doorposts in your doorway and you nail your paper doors on them. The wood got so rotten there was no place to put a nail. And so then, rather than fix them up, those guys come up with an idea that they could make an extension band and you could go back to the next upright 2x and nail to that one. I mean, it was very cobbled up. So that's when trucks began to roll. So I think in a way that maybe the Milwaukee Railroad down here, they put themselves out of business. I mean, they just, rather than spend some of their revenue and keep that stuff up, they put themselves out of business. We leased 3 cars. That got to be a thing. We leased 3 cars to move some of our own grain with, down and back and forth and stuff like that. But the rail line running from Mitchell through Kennebec, Myrtle, Kadoka was a light rail line, and you couldn't fill them very full anyway. So that wasn't practical, except we had some mills and stuff like that liked that hard winter wheat. for flour, and they were equipped on the other end already to handle the hopper cars. So they came to us and said, look, we'd like to buy wheat, but we don't want to unload boxcars. So we leased the hopper cars, and then basically they went back and forth to Minneapolis and dumped practically all the time at the same flour miller because he was equipped to handle them, and he paid us a little premium because he knew our wheat was good and nice. He knew we shipped them good, clean wheat, and so we had a kind of a premium buyer there. So we utilized our lease cars quite well. Well, then it wasn't very long. The railroad shut down completely, and then it deteriorated. Well, we finally got that opened back up again later on, and now they've let it shut back down again. So I don't know what'll happen.
Been a struggle. And of course, at the same time, there were a lot of branch lines that served even smaller communities that were being abandoned completely.
Yep. See, I don't know if the Milwaukee here went off too much going west, but like when it gets to Mitchell, it branched out and went two different directions and stuff like. So, but the Milwaukee, and I imagine the same way with all the other rail lines, they basically put themselves out of business by not providing equipment to handle and not to grow. They didn't grow with the industry, and I've never really had the opportunity to sit back and study it, but people tell me anyway that the railroad, the USA began to grow. The railroad financial people began to put their money in other things, investments other than putting it back into their own company. They didn't care whether the railroad lasted a long time or not. They didn't really care. They had other businesses they were invested in, and they looked after them, and so it basically went down the hill.
Yeah. Not all the railroads were operating that way.
Not all of them, but Milwaukee was...
One's north of us and one south of us that were doing better. But
Milwaukee was one of them that was
Chicago Northwestern pretty much in the same classification.
Yep, they just didn't perceive what the future was going to be like. Now you take Burlington Northern. Now, we live, or my residence here is right close to the Burlington Northern rail line, and they have come on with a boom, and they bought out a couple railroads, and they fix up and upgrade and stuff like that. And they're, 7-10 years ago, you didn't see many oil tankers go through here. Now you'll see 10 and 12 in a row, oil tankers almost like new cars, and lumber. That was another thing that used to come out to Kennebec in wide-doored boxcars for the lumber yard and stuff like that. Today, now they have them open-sided cars where they can unload it all with a forklift, and at times you'll see several loads of lumber go by here. And so they utilize it. And then here in Mitchell, we have a box factory here, and that paper, most of that paper comes in by rail, and that's kind of a little branch line that runs off down here, and that little branch line is very, very busy, taking empties back uptown and pushing loaded cars over there, and they have humongous rolls of cardboard, heavy paper on them that they make them boxes out of, and so that's been a very viable line. Now, but Milwaukee, they never thought about that.
Yeah, and of course, as time went on, that the state of the railroads in South Dakota created a handicap for farmers because they were not getting paid as well as in other areas where there was better transportation. And quicker turnaround.
Things like that made a big difference. I mean, you take when, back in them early days, just one example, back in the early days, GTA had a good grain terminal in Sioux City, but through the changes in the way it was moved from there on out, it wasn't very long until that one wasn't in the right spot. It just wasn't no longer a viable place, and water transportation and everything else changed a lot, and so but the railroads when they were running really allowed us in the early years to really keep things rolling and stuff like that. But then we had to resort to trucks.
Did you serve, it's running through my mind, you served on some sort of rail?
Yes, I was on the South Dakota Rail Advisory Committee for several years and stuff like that.
That was appointed by Governor?
Janklow. Janklow was one of them. I have the article here, but some of the other managers around and business leaders and stuff like that. We were on that advisory board as to how to keep the rail industry busy. And we might even have started out back in the Knipe era. I'm not really sure, but it was quite a while ago, and that was our main goal there. But we could convince the legislators on what the future was going to be like and stuff like that. But the legislators could never convince the railroads that this is what they had to do in order to be for us here in the 90s and the 95s and the 2000s. They couldn't convince the railroad that was what's going to happen. And so basically it all went for naught, because you could not convince them that they should upgrade their equipment, buy bigger locomotives, pull longer trains, replace the small rail line with heavy line, and have a program where they done so many miles a year of tie replacement and get good ballast under them ties and stuff like that. They just didn't do nothing. They just didn't fix up nothing.
Yeah. How important was what finally happened during the Jankel first administration, the state decision to acquire the core lines that leads from the old Milwaukee Road? Which included, I think, at that time they were lying out to Kennebec. Right?
Yeah. See, now in the time when they closed them down, see, that's in the era when I went to Watertown to manage the Cooperative. So I didn't get in on all the final.
Yeah. How long were you up at Watertown?
We went up there in 1974 and went back to Kennebec in 1983.
Okay.
When there again, and they closed it during that period of time and stuff like that. When I went back there in 1983, one of my first visits was to the office of Bill Janklow. And I said, we're going to open that railroad back up again. Yeah. And he convinced me that it would never happen. And I said, no, it'll happen. I said, I'm going to make it happen. And we fought, and we fought, and we fought. And we finally got them to open up the rail line again and run it and lease it out to a private individual. And there again, I am not positive what all happened. But we moved a lot of grain across that line by rail, and then all of a sudden there began to be discrepancies between operator and politics, and for whatever reason, why the operator had to pull out,
Because you had kind of a small branch line.
Yeah, little branch lines, yeah. Dakota Southern.
They get along with the Burlington Northern, did they?
And see, then they were having trouble with the Burlington Northern. And like I said, I don't really know all the difficulties they had, but I do know that some of the things. Now, Dakota Southern run the line. Dakota Southern is still the one that takes care of the cardboard box factory we just talked about. All right, when he would come in and we would load like 75 car trains, big trains of Milo, and he tried to convince politics and them that why not let me take it through Mitchell and take it to Sioux City rather than drop it off at Mitchell, and we had to pay an enormous drop-off fee and a pickup fee, and Burlington Northern, they wanted a fee for everything. And all of a sudden, the Burlington Northern, with all their tacked on expenses and stuff like that, it got to the point where it was cheaper to run the grain down in Nebraska by truck because they would not let the Dakota Southern onto their line. And so it just created one difficulty after another. And I'm sure it was friction between individuals to start with, and that friction grew into which they had to go back and, it was the rail line, But I think it was more friction amongst people. People wanting to oppress, other people wanting to aggress, and no one in the middle to shake their finger and says, here's the happy medium. We'll do this for a while. I mean, they weren't even willing to try it. They didn't even let Alex try the first train. I mean, they wouldn't even try it, see, because they wanted that revenue from Mitchell to Sioux City, see, and as well as the per car fee for allowing to be dropped off here in Mitchell, and they assemble them for a train. So, but anyway, when they closed it back down again, and I don't know what'll happen for sure. There again, I think it would have. I had some very good plans and stuff like that at that time. and I don't know whether it'd be good for Mitchell today or bad for the whole area out through here. But I said, the Chicago Northwestern at that time, you knew was going to go down. And you knew the Milwaukee was going to go down. You could tell that by the way they're doing. I said, why don't the state go out there by Phillips somewhere? I think it's either 12 or 14 miles is all them two railroads are apart. Close the Milwaukee from that point to Rapid. Fix up the Chicago Northwestern from Rapid to that point. Fix up the Milwaukee from that point to Mitchell. And then just let one core system run the whole thing, because the Chicago Northwestern running from Phillip West pretty well took in the area out in through there that was high agriculture, and then they dropped down. I said, it's only good, but I tell you,
you would have made those connections if you were talking about highways.
You
wouldn't have hesitated to connect two highways.
But you just as well talked to the wind, and no one thought that would ever fly, And so now today, like I said, if they'd have done that, there could be the possibility of the coal train moving through this way, and there could be, and railroading is the most efficient way to move grain other than water, probably. Well, we can't move it here by water, so we've got to get it to the water by railroad. And so it was just an obstacle along the way there that we never got corrected, and I don't know how it'll ever turn out for western South Dakota. You take like Mitchell here now, with the Burlington Northern running through here, the upgraded, you can see the rail lines out there. It's the big heavy rail, 125 car trains go whistling right through here, loaded for the West Coast. They come back through empty, and they go down to southeastern South Dakota, pick up a load, away they go, and it's being used a lot.
And you probably got quite a contrast while you managed at Watertown between the rail service there as opposed to what you had.
It was very different. I mean, it was very different up there. The rail line up there they were aggressive. They wanted that revenue to continue. So they kept it alive, and now the rail line runs from north of Watertown down through Castlewood and down along into there. But that line is all closed up now because there again they were not willing to upgrade, and so they went down.
How was there a little bit of difficulty when you were dealing with minimal number of shippers that you could utilize, or railroad or truckers? Even the Burlington Northern could be tough to deal with, couldn't they? As far as economically, price-wise, delivery, giving you what you wanted when you wanted it.
They got very independent. They were very difficult to deal with rate-wise. You take like the Burlington Northern, for instance. They kept moving their headquarters as they merged, and all of a sudden the headquarters was way down south. To them, Kennebec, South Dakota was a spit in the ocean, and they really didn't care because they had so much other volume of business down there that they took their assets and their income from those assets and spend them in them areas down there to upgrade and stuff like that. So they weren't willing to come up here and try to upgrade and build a rail line that really would produce a market for farmers. They just their attitude was, anybody can haul it 200 miles, and then you'll get it on a good line, see, for multiple markets and stuff like that. But it was more practical for us then to drop down south and get onto the Nebraska rail lines down there with a big terminal, and so we just were running down there all the time.
Yeah, have you stayed in touch with the folks out there since they built the fast loading facility up at Highmore?
Yeah. Working pretty good.
Yeah. They do move some big trains through there now. They don't move quite as fast as the Burlington Northern.
No. But that was the only way for them to go.
Yeah.
That was the only way for them to go, is to get up on a rail line and where you could make multiple shipments and stuff like that, because some of that stuff has got to go too far.
What year did you retire?
At the end of 1992.
Okay. So you didn't face the kind of pressure that some of the elevators faced later on to
No.
merge or regionalize, as they call it.
No, I'd see. Like I said, that's why that we talked earlier there about the proper era, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I retired prior to that. They had a program, and you could retire at 55,
mm-hmm.
and so I retired. And after my 55th birthday, I retired and just got into a different mode of life, I guess.
Mm-hmm. 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 How important is cooperative education? You talked a little bit about that earlier on, both for members of the co-op and for young people.
Yeah, I can't help but feel that maybe we've relaxed ourselves a little bit in that line also. I would almost have to wager a bet that if you went to a graduating senior class in a large town, maybe like Mitchell, Huron, Aberdeen, Yankton, whatever, and you took a poll on what cooperatives are, how cooperatives was formed, and how cooperatives operate, I think you would lose a vast majority of them high school scholars because they don't have any idea. Because I think their parents, first of all, for a couple things. First of all, we got way fewer numbers now mm-hmm. going to school that come out of the ag field. Yeah. So maybe educational directors in the schools feel that, well, maybe we have too few students, that we maybe shouldn't dwell on that too much, stuff mm-hmm. like that. So it has to be done then from the outside, such as the Farmers Union and the cooperatives. But I kind of think that we have relaxed ourselves a little bit too much on that, and younger people do not understand that. Mm-hmm. And another thing that probably makes even some of the middle-aged people drift away a lot is because, like you said, the pressure of mergers. You get to merging too many together, and sometimes I think you feel like you've lost your identity. Mm-hmm. And you take there's some places that have 3 and 4 locations, are quite a ways apart, stuff like that, and you don't really know who your manager is. You're not really in touch with him every day like you used to be. So I think that's another thing that has kind of broke mom and dad of talking co-op at home, at the dinner table and stuff like that. So consequently, the younger generation that's in school, they don't have too much of an idea on what co-ops are really, how they're structured,
Mm-hmm. What sort of a relationship did you have over the years with regional co-op representatives? In this case, it probably is GTA we're talking about. I over the years.
There again, it was a very good era when we first started. M.W. Thatcher was in charge of the Harvest States of GTA, mm-hmm. and didn't know him that well. But then Barney Molesky come along, and there couldn't have been a greater person than him. He was in an office that he wanted everyone to have a good time and enjoy their work, but spread the word. He loved to have us spread the word on how valuable co-ops would be in the future. Well, then Barney retired, and I kind of think they got away from that. They're a business now, more so than they are a cooperative, a farmers organization doing business with themselves. Now it's a business. They don't care who they do business with, as long as they do business. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a co-op man or whether you're not a co-op man.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of the regional representatives that you had to work with? The field staff, were they good folks?
Okay, the one that asked me to go to Kennebec was Harry Taylor, lived mm-hmm. in Letcher. There again, he was a former elevator manager there at Letcher. The next one that came in the regional office was Ben Obrump. Ben Obrump was the first man I went to work for down at Ethan. He got out of the elevator and he went into as a field man. Mm-hmm. Then there was on past Ben. Then it's kind of skipped my mind right now. The next one on up, but then Jerry Schmidt mm-hmm. Was at D. Schmidt, and Jerry Schmidt was one of our field men then. And so there was a lot of and each one of them had a very high regard for the farmer himself. And they wanted to make sure that things would go. Then the mergers came along, and faces began to change, and I have to say, and I have to feel, we kind of lost touch.
Mm-hmm. As a manager for many years, did you have a particular approach for working with employees? Did you have a philosophy of how to deal with people that were working for you?
Well, one thing we done there is we had employee meetings and stuff like that, and we had a supper once a month after work, employee meetings, for input from them as well as output from me. And I tried my darndest to make sure I contacted them every day to see how their job was going and see how it could be run better. Mm-hmm. See what we could do to make it work better. We had a great staff. I mean, we had a great staff of employees. When I went from Kennebec to Watertown, there again, they had an old elevator site up there, but we built the new elevator site. And but my employees at Kennebec, some of them were still there when I came back 9 years later. So some are still. 2 of them just retired, I think, but are going to retire anyway. So, but just to make sure, that they weren't a machine. Yeah. They were an individual. They were someone with a heart and stuff like that. That he also, I wanted them to make sure that they had a purpose rather than a job. Mm-hmm. I wanted them to have a purpose, in other words, to do things better, to help people, rather than say, well, I worked 40 hours and got a paycheck. I didn't want that. Yeah. And we had a good staff. And
it's important for co-op employees to understand the cooperative principles as well as the members understanding.
And we sent them to meetings. We made them attend meetings and stuff like that, where they had some good speakers, and to learn. They had to learn the co-op infrastructure, mm-hmm. So they really knew how and why co-ops were formed and the purpose and stuff like that. And I think that's another thing today that has fell off drastically, is the fact that the employees themselves have just got a job. They're just like they're working for John Morrell or somebody like that. I mean, it's just a job. You go there, you dump trucks, you go home at night. You go there, you spread fertilizer, you go home at night. And so it takes a lot of hard work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You think, and this may have changed a bit too, enough cooperation between cooperatives. How were you working on that? Did you communicate with the, say, the oil company manager,
yes,
the rural electric people, whatever?
Yep. Yeah. That was another thing, like with the rural electric people there in Murdo and Red over there in Reliance and stuff like that. Why, we visited back and forth a lot. They were providing a different type of service, the rural electrics were, mm-hmm. but at the same token, we were there for the same reason. We were serving customers, and we were customer owned, and it was to doing business with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And like in Reliance there, we had, the West Central Electric, every one of my customers was a customer of theirs, because that's the only electricity was out there. Mm-hmm. Red in Reliance, he sold fuel and stuff like that to almost all of his customers, potential customers of ours, because mm-hmm. some of them may have lived a little bit too close to Chamberlain or something like that. They didn't come clear back out to Kennebec. But nevertheless, we always had a good working relationship. We never had a confrontation where we thought one was outgrowing the other one was better, and we never tried to duplicate services and stuff like that.
Challenges facing organizations and cooperatives have changed over the years. What seems like the biggest change to you in the difficulties or issues being faced by these businesses that the farmers are supposedly still on, hopefully?
Probably the biggest challenge that cooperatives have today is the fact that, I think anyway, is the fact that they no longer have as much local representation on above on the ladder. You're just hanging on to a ladder. You don't really realize, and you don't know the people that are above you. I'm going to go back to Barney Molesky. You walk into his office and you knew your name. Today, I bet there's a lot of them that would never know who you were if you walked in there, because they don't take the time to know and understand the staff that they have working under them out in the field and stuff like that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is either, and I know that's one of the biggest, they put such a big load on the managers themselves that they probably don't have the time to be involved with all their employees day after day. And I think the same is happening in our schools and stuff like that. There is so much government red tape involved that the superintendents, the managers and stuff like that have to be on top of all the time, that they no longer can be on top of who's working for me. It's who are we working for, and time. It's just time. And of course, sure, you could hire 2 or 3 executives, to each one have a branch, but you can't afford that. That's impossible. So the little things get overlooked.
So you retired in 1992. What have you been doing since then?
We retired and moved to Pierre.
Yeah.
And
I know you were at Pierre for a while.
We moved to Pierre there and stuff like that. And then my father passed away down at Ethan, and my wife's mother and my mother both lived here at Ethan yet. So I told my wife, I said, we've been gone almost 40 years. Why don't we move back down and help our moms? So we moved back to Mitchell to be closer to our mothers and stuff like that. And then while I was in the process of moving, the elevator here in Mitchell had an accident out there, and one of their employees was injured. And I've known Harold Geezer all my life, or all my manager's life and stuff like that. So he found out I was moving back to Mitchell, and so he said, Jack, can you help me? He said, can you help me? And he said, soybean harvest is about to start. I said, oh, I guess so. So I helped him. And what I was going to do when I moved back here, I was going to get a plow on the front of my pickup and a bobcat and move snow in the wintertime, and then do yard work in the summertime. Well, before I ever got the pickup or the plow bought, Harold got a hold of me. So I said, okay, I'll help you through bean harvest. Well, it didn't work out there very long at all. And then his other key employee got hurt. So I was the only one that really understood what to do. And so Harold said, Jack, he says, please stay, So I did. I said I'd stay. Well, so I stayed there about 3 years, I guess, until they merged here. And then there again was the same thing we talked about earlier. Yep. They merged here. I was a number and stuff like that and the things like that. So I did quit then, and then I started what I call handyman service. I delight in helping older people that can't do things for themselves. So I got started with that. And then I have a son, Kurt, who moved back here now. He lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and he kind of got into painting and stuff like that down there. He worked at a paint store and kind of got into painting as a sideline. He said, I want to come back. He said, he was just kind of the same way I was. He'd been gone a long time, and he wanted to come back and probably be closer to his mom and dad before it was too late. So he came back, and so he helps me with some of my work, and he does a lot of painting inside and outside of homes and stuff like that. So, but it's called handyman service. We do everything, but I do not do installation of electricity or installation of plumbing. But we replace doors, windows, sidings. Like right now, today, they're down there and we're completely gutting out the inside of the old Kentucky Fried Chicken store here in town, and that's going to become an office complex. Okay. But we're taking out all the old counters and knocking down walls and stuff like that to accommodate the carpenters that'll go into there. A little bit too big a project for us to get into, But then in the summertime, then I mow lawns. I love to be outdoors, so I'm certified to mow, to fertilize and spray and mow. So I have 15 yards that we take care of in the summertime, trim shrubs up in the fall of the year, and pick up leaves and all that kind of stuff for older people, and do all that little, that little stuff that nobody else can do, and stay real busy at that. So.
You think your cooperative background had kind of some influence on you kind of enjoying helping people like that?
I definitely think it was, because whether they were, after I got here, just helping people, and the kind of the same thing went right back to the cooperative field. You were so trained and so geared to help someone market his grain, and I don't know whether Kennebec was an unusual situation, but there was a lot of people around Kennebec that came to me for advice, on how to do it, how to market, when to market, all, and it's kind of, I think that kind of geared me up to. I help them all the time. I got to help somebody else now. So I started this handyman service, and like I always remark, you don't know how many honey-do lists we do in a year's time, because men don't have time to do it, and so their wives just call us, and we go in there and we paint and decorate and clean and whatever there is to do, and it's kind of rewarding for me to be able to help them older people. And I could go on and on some of the simplest things we've done, some of the things that have delighted people. I'll give you one example. I was over to a lady's house fixing up some stuff, and she said, "You know anything about electricity?" I said, "Well, when you flip the switch, the light bulb is supposed to come on." Well, she said, "I have this old lamp," and she said, "My brother-in-law brought it back from Iwo Jima." And she said, "It's got a 3-way switch, and it won't work anymore." So I went and looked at the light, and I thought, well, I can buy a 3-way switch. So I said, well, I'll take it home with me, and I'll see if I can't fix it for you. So I took it home, and I checked around town, and the light down here, one click, second click, this one comes on, that one goes off, and the third click, they're both on. See, that's the 3-way. And so I couldn't find one. So we went to the secondhand store one day, and sure enough, there was a lamp with one of them, just like brand new, with one of them switches on it. So I put that switch in there for her and took it back to her. I mean, that lady was so happy that lamp that her brother-in-law had given her, 10 years ago, was back to working. And I use that all the time for reading, she said. She was about 85 years old, So just things like that. I mean, just things. I've had them cry and everything else because old things were fixed up for them, and stuff like that. And we winterize homes for people, older people that can't do it themselves. We winterize for them. And so I guess if you wanted to compare one to the other, I always kind of feel like I had a large majority of people in both Kennebec and Watertown that relied on whatever expertise I had to help them with their everyday problems, that this has continued right on through, because that lady had a problem, another man had a problem, and we were able to help them solve that problem. So I think it definitely was a factor.
What kind of advice would you give someone today who maybe was thinking about maybe working for a co-op or getting involved in agriculture in one way or another, or in serving agriculture?
I guess that question is going to be probably a little bit difficult to answer, because I think it's going to be a tough field to try to break into, to where you actually receive the rewards that I felt that I received from that. First of all, they've gotten so big. The second thing is, there's so many businesses today that run like cooperatives, but they don't use co-op in the title. So I think there's a lot of individuals today that are working for big corporations that are basically have the kind of the co-op, the old co-op principle, where they're, and stuff like that, and they probably don't even realize it's quite that involved. But for a young man to come out and ask me today, "Jack, do you think there's a better future in working, let's say, at a co-op elevator versus an independent a business of some type, I'd say, it'd be hard to answer that question, but I sometimes wonder if your career would be as rewarding for the amount of education that young person has in the backgrounding of cooperatives versus working for that company. It'd be a tough question to answer, and the individual would have to be, I think the individual would have to be an inspiring individual that would want to go out and really, really be able to prove himself, stuff like that. Because I think you're probably seeing the same thing with the South Dakota Farmers Union. It's probably harder and harder all the time to find individuals that are so willing to do all the extras like Chuck Groth did and Ben Ratcliffe did and stuff like that. Do all those extras to make sure the organization survived and grew and provided a job for other people 30 years down the road, and I don't know.
Yeah, whether or not people actually put their heart into what they're doing or not.
And I think that we've got less heart in people that work in a garage as far as repairs, work any place you want to work. I tell you, the places that you see today that really impress you is like we have one grocery store here in town where they're really employee orientated and stuff like that. And the people are happy that work there, they're satisfied they work there, and they in turn are putting out extra for those customers that they have a good retail business and stuff like that. So I guess today, if you were talking about the co-op field versus just inspiring young people to be a great leader and stuff like that, it'd probably be easier to inspire them to be just a great leader, a great person to work with and stuff like that down the road a ways. And that's the thing that I think is really lacking today, is inspiration.
Okay. Are you, would you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist?
Little of both.
Little of both. Okay.
Little of both.
I think that's probably an honest answer. I've had most people say an optimist, but if I look at the entire interview I had with him, there's a little pessimism there too.
On some issues, definitely pessimist, and on other issues, optimistic, because we could stand a lot of change. We could stand a lot of change, and I don't know how we're ever going to instill it into these young people's minds. It's probably came a little bit too easy. And I sometimes think you go up to the high school and you drive by the high school parking lot, and there's 75% of the cars that are newer in that parking lot than when I drive to work every day. One issue, they've got automobiles and stuff like that. They didn't have to work to get a nice car. It was given to them. So I just think that, and when we get started out that way, my wife and I were married and stuff like that before we ever had a car. Okay. We didn't go places. If we did go places, we had to use mom and dad's car or somebody else's car because we didn't have the money to buy a car. And holy cow, we had to save up, and my first car cost $65. But I had one.
$275 for me.
Yes. Yeah, bought a 38 Chevy, cost $65, but it ran good. And today, they just things like that, And I sometimes wonder, if we ever go back to that point, our country is in trouble. Big, big trouble. Because one issue is the younger people are not going to know how to work. They're not going to know how to work. And they don't. Sure, there's a lot of them that do, but there's a lot of them that just don't know how to put forth. And so where are we going to, if we have to go back to where a lot of things have to be done by manpower and labor. How are they ever going to get the thing to going? You know, I wish I would have kept the essay, but when I was an 8th grader, and that was probably back, I'll say in like 1950, 51, an 8th grader, we had to write an essay on how we really felt some of the changes were going to be that we were going to have to go through. And I wrote my essay, and one of the topics was wind power. I said, I can't imagine how they ever let it happen that we didn't harness the wind to create electricity, see? I said, I just couldn't imagine. I mean, that's the wind blows. All the thing has to do is spin, you know. Sure, we don't want to go back to those old light plant styles, but I said, you know, we got to harness the wind. They talk about the water. Well, it's got to rain before there's water there. But the wind blows, whether it's dry or cold or hot, whatever. So I said, we have to harness the wind in order to, you know, to create cheaper electricity. And I said, you know, and at that point, the cars were getting bigger. I said, you know, they're going to have to go back and make sure they develop cars, they get high gas mileage, because the day is going to come when our oil and stuff like that is going to be harder and more costly to produce. And so I said they're going to have to create cars that get, you know, a lot better gas mileage so we can maintain that and go back to the little 4 cylinders and stuff like that, you know, so we don't get around as fast, but we get around economically. And I kind of got laughed at, you know. Some of my classmates and stuff like that said, "Oh, who would ever want to go back to a small car? Who would ever, you know?" But I said, I wish I would have kept that, but I.
Well, some of that makes more sense than some. If you remember the kind of articles, futuristic articles that used to be in Popular Mechanics, they were probably a little bit more far-fetched than you were.
So, but like I said, I guess the one place I have it is in the back of my mind, and I know that's how I felt then, and today it's coming back. I mean, I can remember going to Grandpa and Grandma's, and they had the old wind charger, and I thought to myself, you know, how much cheaper could it be? You just go out there and turn it on, let the wind charge electricity, charge all them batteries up in the basement, go upstairs, you got lights and stuff like that. And I was too young at that point to even think that, well, that old wind charger wouldn't run a 220 volt electric stove. I mean, I was too young at that time but I knew it lit the bulbs, you know, I knew it played the radio, stuff like that. But I just couldn't figure out how come they ever gave up on the concept of harnessing the wind. I just couldn't believe that. But
I've got one last question, and I never know what I'm going to get with it, but is there anything else you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
No, I think you've covered things pretty close. I really wouldn't know what. The only thing in closing, I would say this, that my years of being manager at Kennebec, manager at Watertown, back into Kennebec and stuff like that, and my association with the South Dakota Farmers Union and the other rural cooperatives is probably one of the best lives that I could have ever had. I don't know of anybody that sure, there's little pits along the way, but when I go to bed at night, I thank the good Lord for all the blessings He's gave us. He's given us, the wife and I, 52 years of marriage. He's given us 5 healthy children. He's given us a bunch of healthy grandkids and stuff like that. He's gave me a job all my life. My kids never had to go hungry. We had to work, and that's another thing that we did. We had a little acreage there at Kennebec, and my kids had to work. We would raise 40 bucket calves at a time, and the girls had to get up and mix the milk and put on the buckets on the fence. I built a deal to push them through. But that kept them busy. They had to help haul hay, do their chores at night and stuff like that. So it kept them busy, and it created a great lifestyle. I'm sure sometimes my wife kind of got cheated out of time there, but we were busy that way, and so it's been a great life.
Okay, we've been visiting with Jack McBrayer. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.